Life Issues with Vicky Gibbons on UCB1.
Welcome to another Life Issues on UCB as we talk parenting. When a couple decides to start a family, a plethora of emotions and thoughts can start to spin in their minds. The hopes, dreams, expectations, anxieties, but above all else, most commonly, mum or dad-to-be wants their child to be healthy and happy. The first opportunity to really meet your little boy or girl normally arrives on a screen, courtesy of an ultrasound scan, and you carefully listen, watch and wait for the heartbeat. But what do you do if what follows next is the news that your baby has abnormalities? For some children, thankfully, they can be treated with the right medication, operation or support. However, birth defects can be severe and ultimately life-threatening. Hymn writer, ordained minister of the Church of Scotland and member of the Iona community, John Bell, admits to how faith isn't an insurance policy against disaster, but the means by which we can walk through the darkest of valleys and believe that there will yet be light. How did Karen and Gordon Palmer find God's light whilst travelling the darkest of valleys with their first child, Jennifer Grace, born to them only to die hours later? It's today's Life Issues. I'm Vicky Gibbons and thank you for being with us for this conversation. Karen and Gordon, let's start with how you met. It was through the Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship. Gordon, you were at Edinburgh and Karen at Aberdeen. You then got married the day before Karen graduated. Karen, why did you want to enter the world of medicine and specialising in psychiatry?
It was one of these things I just always, since I was little, wanted to be a doctor. Initially, I had thought maybe that God was calling me overseas. And then when I qualified, I was still thinking that maybe I would do some kind of general training so that maybe some time I could go overseas. But I did 6 months psychiatry as part of that and just fell in love with psychiatry.
And Gordon, how about you at that time thinking, before starting family life, where were you at in terms of faith and ministry and leading a church?
When Karen and I got together, it was clear to me that I was going into ministry. And so part of the deal would, if she was going to be with me, is that she would be a minister's wife. And so we'd kind of gone into it together. We were working to, saw it together as working in the parish. That first year, though, as Karen said, her hours were huge. But beyond that, we had settled down, I think, after that first year in terms of Karen being around a lot more and sharing together in the work. And we were both, I think, very happy in Rochesia where we were. But we'd actually been quite keen to start a family for a couple of years before Jennifer came along. And so we were kind of well geared up for it. So when we found out that Karen was carrying Jennifer, we were just over the moon. In fact, it was a Christmas, just before Christmas we found out, and it was just lovely, and we were looking forward to it. I don't think we had thought very far ahead in terms of it's going to be like this or it's going to be like that, but just clear this was something that we wanted to do together, and this was the next stage of the next chapter unfolding.
And how about your experience, Karen? Because initially you were perhaps at a different place to Gordon in terms of he was quite confident about the pregnancy. You were maybe a little bit more cautious.
Maybe being a doctor made me a bit more cautious. A bit of family history as well. Maybe like my mum had a little boy who just lived for 3 months. I was aware that she'd also had a miscarriage. My grandmother had lost a little boy, again, just very young. And I remember driving along in the car once I knew I was pregnant, thinking, I don't have any friends that have had any problems having children. So maybe that makes me the person that's going to have problems. I remember that thought and just feeling a bit kind of matter of fact about it almost. And I was working at a hospital for people with learning difficulties. Severe learning difficulties. And so, it was all around me, just the possibilities of pregnancy not being straightforward.
Keith was your younger brother. You were 6 years old at the time when Keith passed away. He was 3 months.
Yes.
bereavement, support for siblings and care of mental health is so different today compared to what it was back in 1967. Growing up, were you aware so much of grieving the loss of Keith?
I was, but this sounds like a very disloyal thing to say, and maybe I can say it because my mum's no longer living, but it was always seen in our family as my mother's grief. It wasn't ever framed as the family's grief. I think it was harder for my older brother. So I was 6 and he was 8. My little brother doesn't remember much about it at all. He was 3. So he really has no memories of it. But yeah, no, it was like and I think probably it was the effect of the grief on my mother also that was a very frightening thing for me as a child. It felt like the world was ending because my mother was so distressed, and there was never anybody really to talk to me about that. And actually, that wasn't unravelled for me until many years later, through going to Crew's bereavement counselling for 6 sessions. And the person that referred me there thought the problems I was having at the time were to do with Jennifer. But actually what was unravelled was that very frightening feeling when my mother was so distressed when I was 6. There's much more recognition about it now. There's much more support for grieving children and much more recognition of their grief, which is great.
And it's something we'll come back to in a little while. Gordon, I was really struck in reading the story of Jennifer, how her story echoes Jesus' story. You start off with celebrating her potential arrival, hearing the good news at Christmas, and then how things dramatically change in the run-up to Easter and Holy Week. Take us to what was happening in and around that time.
Well, it was the Monday of Holy Week, and Karen was off, and Karen said that she was uncertain about the baby. She hadn't felt the baby kicking and so on. And we just went to the hospital just to check. And I suppose still at that point, I'm still thinking Karen worries more than I do. This will be Karen being very, very concerned. And it was then that at the hospital, we got the news that, in fact, there was something very badly wrong. The doctor said that he didn't think that Jennifer would go to term. And he gave us a few days space to decide, talk through what we were going to do. He was absolutely great. But yeah, that Monday of Holy Week was when we found out that something was very, very wrong. And in our local church for a few years, this hasn't really been a Church of Scotland practice widespread, certainly not in the early 90s, would be to have a service every night in Holy Week. But we did. And we divvied it up between different folks in the congregation. So both Karen and I were going. Karen had been involved, I think, in preparing the service, but wasn't going to be delivering it because of what we just found out. So she had a hand in shaping the service. And we were just very aware of just going through the pain and the suffering of Holy Week and Easter at that time.
Karen, what about your response and where you were at? Because presumably you had this family history. You were trusting in God up until that moment that actually things would be healthy and all right for the baby. And then suddenly we're at this time of approaching Easter where we know Jesus conquers the grave, defeats the sting of death. And you have this prognosis that you're unlikely to go full term. What was your reaction?
I mean, the promise of resurrection we didn't get there until the Sunday of at the end of Holy Week. So I suppose where I was in that was just at the beginning of Holy Week and the service that Gordon's talking about. I just think it was amazing. It blows my mind still to think about it. there were words, there was a refrain that we had put in for the service for people to say twice during the service. And it was a paraphrase really of Hosea 11 that the Wild Goose worship group had put together, where it's God saying, "How can I give you up? My love for you is too strong. I'm God and not man." And also the theme for that service was good news for the unimportant. And 3 times, we used a lot of responsive readings in Rochesi, 3 times the congregation had to say, "Thank you, God, that all of us are important to you." And it just was astonishing in terms of God saying, I know about this child, and this child is really important to me, and I love this child, and there's no way I'm going to abandon this child or let her go. So having that on the Monday of Holy Week, nothing else kind of mattered, really. And I know that sounds a bit strange, but the fact that God loved her and that God had organised all of that for us as a really blatant message that we just couldn't miss. That was a huge strength through the whole pregnancy. And we knew that day that she wasn't likely to live. And over the next 3 days, we gradually came to terms with it, and that was before we got to Easter Sunday. And so the promise of the resurrection then was the promise of a future resurrection. It wasn't that, this is something that's promised and we're not getting it. It was definitely that the strength from Easter Sunday was knowing that death isn't the end.
Karen, in the book, you explore about going to visit Gordon's parents and them asking the why question, which is perhaps so familiar for other couples who find themselves in that situation. The why is this happening to us? Could we have done anything to avoid it? Were those kind of questions not also running through either of your minds?
Not really, to be honest. And I mean, Gordon's explained it before in terms of where we were living, because we were living in an urban priority area with very remarkable people who had coped and were coping with multiple tragedies and difficult situations. And so people around about us had gone through amazing suffering and still were. And they were the people who were part of our church. And who formed our church, and so we didn't somehow it didn't feel a relevant question to ask at the time, because suffering was just part and parcel of life for the people that we were with.
Just that the why me became quickly why not me. I think Karen said their context very much meant that we were working with folks in incredible hurt, and there's a sense in which I found it almost offensive to think that we should be somehow exempt from that. So it was very. I think that probably the context made it a lot easier.
And in those few days where you'd obviously had that initial prognosis, you then went away from the hospital before going back to see Dr. Matthew, who sounds like a remarkable doctor that you were in the care of. You had a cascade of prayers and support from a whole network of not just the church, but family and friends as well. It was something that you decided to go public about and share what was happening. Some perhaps would close doors and shun people away, but you chose not to.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's different. So I think because we did that doesn't mean that that's what everybody should do. But that just seemed a natural. It was a cry for help, really. We knew we needed prayer support, and so we wanted as many people as possible. And it was a cry for help, but also it was to protect ourselves as well, because we wanted people to know, so that people then didn't just assume everything was fine and then make some comment that then was going to be really hard for us and then really awkward for them. So we really wanted the news shared as widely and as openly as possible.
And it wasn't easy to explain what was going on. You talk a little bit about, she wasn't sick, but then it felt strange using that word abnormalities. help us understand a little bit about what were the challenges that she had. Various nicknames, Butterbean, Whoosh Whoosh. Tell us about what were the huge challenges that she was facing.
In terms of what had been seen in the scan, the main finding was that she didn't have very much fluid round about her. And the amniotic fluid protects the baby, but also it helps the baby's lungs and kidneys to develop. So that was the main thing. And then there were a variety of other things, just slightly not quite right shaping of different parts of her body. There was an arm that where the hand looked clawed and it looked as if the arm was useless. There was some slight abnormality in the lining of the brain, the tissue surrounding the brain. So just all these wee bits and bobs. And the doctor, whose name, I had to use Dr. Matthew for the book, but what he said was there was nothing major to see, but just lots of little things that all added up to something very big. But all the words that he used were very clinical. He knew I was a doctor by this stage. And so he used clinical words to me, and those were the words that I had then. And if I used those words to other people, it made me seem very cold and detached. So that in terms of my work colleagues, some of them just took it for granted that I would have a termination. They didn't even ask. But if we used other words, then people would say, "Oh, it'll be fine," or "What treatment can you get?" Or it was just really difficult to explain to people that there was nothing that could be done.
Was that a hard line to walk? Because I imagine within church community, church family, friends, they would have potentially been praying for her healing and recovery.
The hardest bit for me was I was at a conference for folks who were fairly recently into parish ministry, and one of the speakers at the conference was someone who had quite a well-known healing ministry in Scotland. And I remember speaking to him after the session about whether he'd ever prayed for the unborn. And so we had a conversation around that. He was helpful. He had prayed for the unborn. He was cautious in terms of, I'm not just going to jump in and do this right away, lay hands on your wife, can I come tomorrow kind of thing. He was much more cautious than that. And during that cautious conversation, I had a strong sense of, we're not after this. Somehow it's not right. I did not feel that I had the faith to. I didn't feel that it was right in any sense for us to expect some kind of reversal of the diagnosis. Just no sense of that was something that we should be going for or looking for or expecting.
And Karen, after that first appointment, it wasn't that you had spoken about termination at that point, but you had been given an option of some kind of test. Help us understand a little bit more about what CVS is.
Amniocentesis, which would be the normal test to see if there's any chromosomal abnormality, is taking a sample of the amniotic fluid. But chorionic villus sampling is where they actually go and they take a little bit of the tissue. I mean, this is a long time ago, Vicky. I'm not remembering properly, but I think either from the placenta or from thereabouts. So not touching the baby, but obviously there's less fluid. You've got a needle. You're taking tissue, which is a bit more tricky than taking something from a big bag of fluid. So there's a slightly increased risk of spontaneous abortion, spontaneous termination of the pregnancy with chorionic villus sampling. I mean, people still have it done, and it doesn't always cause that, but there's a slightly increased risk. And doctor had said he thought it was important that we have it for the sake of future pregnancies. He said, so that we would know what we were dealing with. And that seemed very sensible on the Monday. And I think what he gave us in terms of the 3 days was a great gift and actually incredibly unusual. I didn't realise how unusual it was until afterwards, that many people don't get given that 3 days because your thinking's not right. Your head's your head's not straight when you get that kind of news, because you're shell shocked. And suddenly being given decisions to make on day one of hearing that kind of news is isn't fair, really, because people then make decisions that they later horribly regret. And I've met people that have horribly regretted decisions that were made that quickly. But we were given 3 days, which doesn't sound like a lot, but actually that was huge.
Karen, from obviously going back to the hospital, deciding against having CVS, then what happened for the rest of the pregnancy? Because it's a weird dynamic of knowing that at some point the worst could happen. You might not go full term, but obviously also hoping that you might reach that milestone.
Well, that's right. The great hope was that we would get to meet Jennifer. But at the same time, I was anxious, just about my physical condition, just because because doctor said that he felt the pregnancy was not likely to go to term. He thought it probably wouldn't, and I'd not had a miscarriage before, and I was scared, I think, really, of what that would be, and so. People didn't leave me on my own. I was either at work, driving to and from work, which was a bit of a commute, but I was generally looked after by, there'd always be somebody with me. And when I was on maternity leave, my friends and family made sure there was always somebody with me. I was away at a conference at one point, and so I stayed with friends. It's a long time ago, and it's difficult to remember right back into that. But reading my diaries, I was really well looked after by friends, by colleagues, by family, who just kept me company in case something like that would happen, in case I went into early labour.
And Jennifer's diaries, you started before you knew about the prognosis. Was keeping diaries like that was something that you've always done, or what triggered it for Jennifer?
I don't know what triggered it for Jennifer. So it's really strange. Firstly, that I bought just a really small notebook, which shocks me, because why did I buy such a small notebook when I don't know, maybe I didn't realise I was going to write so much, I'm not sure. And I bought a really pretty one that had a really lovely cover, which if Jennifer had been a boy, would have been really inappropriate. But of course I didn't know at that time that she was a boy. I just thought it would be, I'd written diaries as a child for myself, and I like books that are diaries, like Daddy Longlegs. I don't know if you've come across that book. I love books that are letters and diaries, and so I just thought a diary for her would be a nice thing to do.
And tell us a bit about Dr. Al-Rumi, because you did eventually have to start thinking about how to prepare for Jennifer's birthday. It was a hope-filled conversation, but a very practical one as well.
Yeah, it was hope-filled. So I had to see her because I went for a scan, which gave the prognosis as very poor for Jennifer being able to be born vaginally. We wanted to give Jennifer the best chance, and so we asked for a section. And because I was asking for a section, we were asking for a section, I had to meet a paediatrician. And she was lovely. She wanted the whole story from the beginning. There were tears in her eyes as she was listening, and she just was so concerned for our baby. She was hopeful. She also said, she was wrong. She said, things might not be as bad as they look in the scan, and they were. But the fact that she gave me that bit of hope was really helpful, because I was at a really low ebb at that point, and thinking that everything's really hopeless. And the fact that Dr. Al-Rumi gave me that bit of hope really helped. It felt like God was giving me that so that I could keep loving and hoping for this child.
And Gordon, describe to us what happened on Jennifer's birthday. It was Tuesday the 3rd of August. You knew, of course, that this C-section was going to take place. What do you remember of that day?
I remember, Karen had gone into hospital the day before. So on the Monday night, I was alone in the manse, and I remember going in to the hospital on the first day. And as I walked up the road to the hospital, I came across a car with a Christian sign on it, and also a text on the back of the car. And I can't remember the text actually. I just remember that being so affirmed by that as I was going there. There was something that was just, a kind of word. I stopped and I wrote a wee note and stuck it on the guy's windscreen, and just continued on. Both sets of parents wanted to come, obviously, and be there for us. So I just remember a kind of juggle of trying to kind of keep everyone in touch. The section, the delivery was very fast. It was the first op of the day. I just remember the only time any urgency came from doctors, he said, reach out and touch her quick before he handed her over to be looked after. We were given at one point just a kind of, this might not be so bad, and at that point I felt really quite guilty, in as much as I had not really considered the possibility that we might be taking home a child who was severely disabled. I just hadn't thought about that, and I suppose there was about half an hour or 40 minutes where that was kind of a possible outcome or scenario from what we were hearing. And I remember being thrown by that, to be honest.
So just explain, because there was some confusion, wasn't there, in hospital with the information that was shared about how well Jennifer was actually doing.
Yes, that's right. Sorry, yes, you're correct. Karen will give you more detail on that. But just from the kind of, she might not be born alive, she is alive. As I say, first, at one point, word came back that maybe some of the organs were not as undeveloped as they had feared, and so maybe this would be a child who would survive, albeit with fairly severe disabilities. So it was when that information was coming over that I kind of found myself thrown for a while. But then quite soon afterwards, on a visit just to the kind of intensive care bit, they were saying, no, it's very clear that it's at the moment it's just a machine that's kind of keeping her alive, and there's no chance of her surviving on her own.
Karen, there was a gap, wasn't there, for you as well? You delivered Jennifer Grace, and then it was a while until you actually got to go and see her.
Yes, because it was a section, it was about 3.5 hours before I was able to go. And certainly when I went upstairs, it had been one of the paediatricians that had come and said that everything looked actually not bad and everything was operable. So it was really exciting. So I went upstairs thinking this is a baby that's going to live. And it was only getting upstairs and one of the doctors in special baby care coming over that we discovered that actually wasn't the case, that the information we'd been given wasn't right. So so she lived for 5 hours and I was there for an hour and a half, just the last hour and a half.
Were you in that moment not angry at the miscommunication and what that meant?
I don't remember being angry, Vicky. No, I don't remember being angry at all. I suppose it was the frustrating thing was that my parents left. I think the thing I was most perturbed about was my parents had left the hospital because they'd gone to look at prams. They thought, yeah, she's going to live. Let's go and look at prams. And my dad, who was so upset about this afterwards, my dad thought, well, that's fine. I can go back and chair the church meeting that I was going to be chairing. And so he left Glasgow, and so he wasn't around. So that was awful for him, not being around after Jennifer died. And he felt terrible about that. So, those were the worst things, really.
And Karen, you said you had just over an hour with Jennifer Grace. How precious, when you look back on that time, was it for you, becoming a mum at that point as well?
Yeah, it was It was lovely. I mean, it feels, I know it was an hour and a half, but when I think back, it felt like an incredibly short time. So some of that time was just us standing, both of us standing, looking at her, and she was in an incubator, she was on a ventilator, she had various tubes. But being able to put our hands in the wee kind of portholes, and if you put a finger down on her hand, then our fingers just curled round. She had that reflex, and we hadn't prayed for her healing, but we'd asked people to pray that she would be peaceful and comfortable, and that was really important because when there's not much amniotic fluid around the baby, as Gordon said, it can be really awful in terms of the constrictions around a baby's limbs. There was no sign of that at all. Her ears were a wee bit pushed back, but her arms and legs moved perfectly normally, and there were no signs of these kind of constricting bands that are somewhere there. And it just seemed a real answer to prayer that she'd been comfortable despite the lack of amniotic fluid, and she just seemed very peaceful.
And in the book, you share of your confidence of knowing that she is with God, safe with him, cosy cuddled and whole, you say. And this experience was also a healing time for your mum, who obviously thought a lot about Keith following the arrival of Jennifer.
It was amazing for my mum, absolutely amazing, because her experience had been so different. She'd not been able to hold Keith. She'd not been able to sit in the hospital where he was even able to see her face from his cot. And so she was able to come. By the time she came, Jennifer had died, but she was able to come, and she was able to help us dress her. We'd taken some clothes, and she helped us do that. And she took the photographs that we've got of Gordon and me with Jennifer. And then she went and I could hear her having a long conversation with the doctors and the nurses about Keith. And the doctors and the nurses were very gracious and lovely, and just listened to her talk about Keith.
And Gordon, of course, you went on to have a funeral service for Jennifer Grace. Not something that everyone who has been through baby loss or miscarriage always has. Why do you think actually that's such a valuable part of the grieving process?
Well, actually, I think, death anyway is kind of intangible for folk. And I at any stage, encourage folks to go down the tangible road as much as they can, and find things to remember someone by and keep things. And particularly when life was so short, we had measured, I think, on that during the pregnancy. I think during the pregnancy there was we affirmed Jennifer is with us, in everything that we were doing, because, we weren't sure there was going to be anything much post-pregnancy. And so we had already gone down that road of noting and keeping as much by way of things in the tangible experiences as possible. And in a sense then to have the funeral, I think was another, logical part of that. We also were just so grateful to so many friends and family members who'd been such a support, that I think it was important for us and for them, to gather as a community who had been through this together and who had shared this together.
Having left hospital, returning home, fast forward the clock on, you eventually moved away from that community that had supported you. Was that an important part of your healing, your recovery, making that choice of changing the direction of where you were at in life? Absolutely not,
in the sense that it was a move from church to another church, but I very clear in my mind it was nothing to do with moving on from Jennifer or Jennifer's story. Absolutely not. A few friends made that connection incorrectly and said to us, "Oh, maybe you just need to leave that part of you behind." No, we felt it was a different stage and phase of ministry for us. But no, it wasn't we need to put this away or put this behind us.
And Karen, how did you find returning to work? In the book, you talk about the normal invitations that come in life, like attending weddings and prize givings and trying to find some normality, even though Jennifer Grace was always going to be a part of your family.
Yeah, going back to work was really hard. And I think because I think this is still the case, that people don't like to talk about baby loss very much. And so although my immediate colleagues, the people who were the same grade as me in terms of training, had been really supportive during the pregnancy and had come to the funeral, other colleagues, like senior colleagues, didn't talk about Jennifer and hadn't prepared people for me coming back to work. So the worst instant really was a lovely social worker who at the end of my first day said something along the lines, "Oh, you'll be keen to get home to your bouncing baby." And that was just awful. And actually our relationship was never quite the same again after that. He always felt awkward with me after that, and I thought that was a shame. I went to see him because I had been really stressed, and obviously he had been really upset. And the following day I'd gone and looked for him and had a conversation and said, "No, it's okay, it's not your fault." But there just always remained an awkwardness between us after that, which was just really sad. That was all preventable. But what isn't preventable are these other things, weddings, and I suppose prize givings maybe aren't such a big thing anymore as they were then. But where you had all these parents with all these gorgeous infants being carried forward to get their baptisms in church. That's an infant baptism tradition that we're in the Church of Scotland. Yeah, those were all really hard, and there's nothing really that you can do about that, I don't think, except be prepared and hopefully have people round about you that are sensitive to how difficult that is.
What are the helpful, the constructive things that we can ask as a church community for a couple that has had that experience of baby loss, which perhaps, as you shared, we shy away, we feel awkward, we don't ask anything at all?
Again, I think it's different for each couple or each individual. So I think it's worth asking, what can we do to help? What would be good? I've got to know quite a few lost parents on Instagram since the book was published, because that's where I went, or where I was pushed to by Sally, our third daughter. And one of the women on there, she's not a Christian, lovely woman. She and her husband put out instructions really for their daughter's birthday, the day that was going to be their daughter's first birthday, but then said, "This is what we want you to do every year on her birthday." And her daughter's birthday is summer. And so she said, "Every year on this day, we want you to treat it as the first day of summer. We want you to eat ice cream, put sunglasses on, wear flip-flops." And it's brilliant. So I think something like that helps. And the other thing is with children, or anybody who has children, that they all like to talk about their children or grandchildren. That doesn't change when your child has died. And it's just the loveliest thing for people to say, what was she like? Who did she look like? What colour was her hair? What colour were her eyes? Anything at all. Why did you choose her name? That's such a pretty name. Just the normal questions, and I know they're awkward, but it's worth getting over the awkwardness to help people feel less alone.
Some of the kind of more general points really ought to be borne in mind. I mean, you should not say to anybody, "I know how you feel." Yeah, and I think that goes for any bereavement. Actually, I think people should just be banned from saying, "I know how you feel." We might know something of what it's like if we've been through similar experiences, but we do not know how anyone feels. And so I think the best thing for folks is to move from the mindset of "I know what this must be like" to saying "I don't know, and because I don't know, I'm going to ask." That would be the best thing.
Do you think John Bell's actions, writing the song, a cradling song, has helped many more within the church community engage through your own personal experience? Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
We know John. We don't know John very well, and it was a mutual friend who lived in Rochese at the time, who missed the funeral because he was away doing ministry in a summer placement. It was he who was having lunch or something with John and was just telling John the story of what had happened. He'd been away and had missed it and was sorry he'd missed it and told John. And John, who has a remarkable empathy for all kinds of scenarios, I think he was on a train journey not long after having been told about her story, and he said the song just kind of poured out of him just on the train. He wrote the words. The tune didn't come till much later, but the words he wrote at the time. I think it has. I mean, I don't know how much of impact it has going on. I mean, it's now in the current Church of Scotland hymn book, actually, CH4. So folks obviously have used it enough or thought enough of it to include it. And I know of ministers who have taken funerals of babies who have read the words at a service. Actually, a year ago, I think, maybe 2 years ago, I was in the house of one of our elders whose sister was a hospital chaplain in Edinburgh, and therefore had, in her work as a hospital chaplain, been through many similar things. And the chaplain did not know that the song had been written about our daughter. Thought that the John called the tune Jennifer, and this hospital chaplain thought maybe that was a reference to Gordon Brown's baby Jennifer, who was just slightly after ours time-wise, and then didn't know that. And then on finding that out, she then quoted the whole of the first verse, just like that, to her sister, just sitting in the room. So this hospital chaplain, who didn't know it was about us or anything, was obviously carrying the words around with her. It's obviously something that she had been doing and using in her work. And that was lovely to hear, actually.
Beyond just a cradling song, of course, Karen, you have your article, Peace and Pain, has gone on into so many different arenas to impact people's lives. And I guess that connection with Gordon Brown as well. Explain why you wanted to write that article in the British Medical Journal.
The main substance of the journal is academic articles, but they also use what they call fillers, where you can just kind of tell me anecdotes, and they give themes for them. So like a patient that's affected my practice or something or other. So I had just put in this wee personal view. And the reason I did it was because there had been a personal view written by the father of a child who had been diagnosed again during pregnancy as having multiple abnormalities, which is what we were told. And they had opted for a termination. And he was just talking about how difficult that had been, and how they had felt rushed, and they'd been in a kind of conveyor belt. They'd been put in the position of having to make decisions when their minds weren't straight, and they'd been kind of rushed through it. And he just talked about that. And I thought, goodness, we had 3 days, and what a difference those 3 days made. And I thought that was worth sharing. I was writing it for doctors who might be in a position to give people those 3 days. That made it worth telling. And I also wanted to explain what unfolded through us making a very different decision.
And of course, following that, you went on to be a part of more conversations looking into care. You have 2 beautiful grown-up daughters now. Ruth, who of course has started her own family, Sally, an adult too. What is the lasting thought to Jennifer Grace, and what God has taught you, even today, is still teaching you through her legacy?
That he's intimately involved in our life, that he's here, and that he loves us even when we're not at all perfect. That message from the Monday of Holy Week service was that God loves people that we view as unimportant, and that doesn't just apply to Jennifer. That applies to lots of us who might feel we're unimportant, or lots of other people that we might view as unimportant. That God loves them and treasures them, but also that he's with us in everything that we're going through.
I want to encourage folks to keep on, or finding ways of keep on acknowledging and remembering. We've already said people are different, so you have to be careful. There are maybe some folks that just kind of want to move away from the experience, and you have to, I suppose, allow them to if they're going to do that and want to do that. But for those who, like Karen and I were, finding it helpful for others to be part of the experience, I think if there are ways you can keep on remembering and keep on honouring that in someone or for someone, can be very, very helpful. I mean, we've really appreciated that when it came to the baptism of the two, of Ruth and Sally, without us asking the ministers who were taking the service, they both included Jennifer in the service. We've really valued folks who have mentioned in the Christmas cards Jennifer. We've appreciated that, and I think where folks have allowed you to be part of it, then I think I would say to folks, please do what you can to remember that you can still be part of it 5, 10, 15, 20 years later. Because another thing that has struck us is that when we went through this and things, so many people have come and said, this happened to me too 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and we're even last year still finding out this about folks, and so people carry the soreness and the dislocation, and a lot of folks who carry that from years gone by when it wasn't talked about and brushed under the carpet, they're still hurting. So I think if we find ways to bring that to the surface for folks, it's important not just to do that and then say, 5 minutes later have moved on from it, but as much as possible to carry it with them.
Karen and Gordon Palmer, thank you so much for sharing Jennifer Grace's story with us on UCB.
Thanks very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Jennifer Grace's life may have been a short one, but God used the waiting for her arrival and her physical presence in those few hours to impact so many people's lives. As Karen has shared, through her daughter, they have received a clear demonstration of God's love and care for the damaged and vulnerable, and of God's intimate involvement with each of us. We've been exploring Karen Palmer's book, which is called Jennifer, A Life Precious to God. It's published by Instant Apostle, and Karen has included numerous links and resources to support anyone who's experienced or wants to understand more about baby loss.